Have you ever witnessed something so impossible that your mind refused to believe it, even as your eyes were seeing it? I'm talking about the kind of moment that splits your life into before and after, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Well, let me tell you about the day I stopped my boss's funeral because I saw her breathe, and what happened next didn't just save her life, it changed mine forever. My name is irrelevant to this story, but what matters is that I was there. I saw it. And I did something that everyone around me thought was absolutely insane. Some called me a hero afterward. Others thought I had lost my mind from grief. But the truth is far more complex and terrifying than anyone could imagine. This isn't just a story about a miraculous survival. It's about trust, about listening to that voice inside you when everyone else is telling you you're wrong, and about the fragile thread that separates life from death. I still remember every single detail of that day with crystalline clarity. The smell of the lilies surrounding her coffin, the weight of the humid air in the funeral home, the sound of muffled crying echoing off the walls, and that one moment, that single breath that changed everything. Before I tell you what happened at the funeral, you need to understand who Sarah was to me and why this whole situation became even more devastating than you might think. Sarah wasn't just my boss. She was my mentor, my friend, and honestly, the closest thing I had to family in this city. I had moved here 5 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, running from a past that didn't matter anymore, looking for a fresh start in a place where nobody knew my name or my failures. Sarah hired me when I was at my lowest, when every other company had rejected me, when I had started to believe that maybe I wasn't cut out for this industry after all. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself anymore, potential buried under layers of self-doubt and fear. Working with her wasn't just a job, it was a transformation. She taught me everything. Not just about the technical aspects of our work, but about life, about resilience, about standing up for yourself even when the whole world seems to be pushing you down. We had countless late-night conversations in the office, sharing coffee that had gone cold hours ago, talking about our dreams, our fears, our pasts. She told me about her daughter Emily, about the husband she lost to cancer 10 years ago, about how work had become her refuge and her purpose. I told her things I had never told anyone, about the family that rejected me, about the mistakes that haunted me, about the person I was trying to become. She never judged, never pitied, just listened and understood in a way that made me feel truly seen for the first time in years. Our relationship transcended the typical boss-employee dynamic and became something deeper, something sacred. She was 52 years old, vibrant, full of life, always laughing with this infectious energy that could light up the darkest room. She had this habit of humming old jazz songs while working, and she collected vintage teacups from every country she visited. She was meticulous about details, passionate about justice, and fiercely protective of the people she cared about. The office felt different when she walked in, safer somehow, like everything would be okay, as long as she was there. Looking back now, I realize I had become dependent on her presence, on her guidance, on the stability she represented in my chaotic world. So when I got that phone call on a regular Tuesday morning, when I heard Emily's voice breaking with grief on the other end, when she told me that her mother was gone, my entire world shattered into a million pieces. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out everything that mattered, leaving just this hollow, aching void that threatened to swallow me whole. I need you to understand this because what I did at the funeral, the way I reacted, it all makes sense only when you know how much Sarah meant to me, how losing her felt like losing myself. The call came at 7:15 in the morning, and I remember that detail because I was staring at my phone screen, watching the numbers change from 7:14 to 7:15, wondering if I should answer this unknown number or let it go to voicemail like I usually did with numbers I didn't recognize. Something made me answer, some instinct that whispered that this call mattered, and the moment I heard Emily's voice, choked with tears and barely coherent, I knew my life was about to change in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. She could barely get the words out between sobs, her voice cracking and breaking like shattered glass. And at first, I couldn't understand what she was trying to tell me, because my brain refused to process the impossible words coming through the phone. "Mom is gone," she kept saying. "Mom is gone. She's dead. She died last night." And I just stood there in my kitchen, coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips, feeling the world tilt sideways as if gravity had suddenly decided to change direction. My first reaction wasn't grief, it was pure, absolute denial. "No," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "No, that's not possible. I just saw her yesterday. She was fine. We had lunch together, she was laughing, she was making plans for next week's presentation. But Emily kept crying, kept insisting that it was true, that her mother had collapsed at home around midnight, that the paramedics had tried everything but couldn't revive her, that she was gone, just gone, like that, without warning, without goodbye. The doctors said it was a massive stroke, she told me through her tears. They said it was instantaneous, that she didn't suffer, that there was nothing anyone could have done. Those words, meant to be comforting, felt like knives stabbing into my chest over and over. I remember dropping the coffee cup, watching it shatter on the kitchen floor, the dark liquid spreading across the tiles like blood, and thinking absurdly that Sarah would have known exactly how to clean that up. She always knew how to fix things, how to make everything better. The grief hit me in waves after that initial shock wore off, each one more devastating than the last, threatening to pull me under and drown me in sorrow so deep I couldn't see the surface anymore. I called in sick to work, which felt surreal because work was Sarah, and how could I go to that office and sit at that desk and pretend to care about anything when she was gone? I spent the next 3 days in a fog, going through the motions of being alive while feeling completely numb inside, attending the wake, helping Emily with arrangements, writing a eulogy that I could barely read through my tears. Everyone kept telling me how sudden it was, how unexpected, how she had seemed so healthy and vibrant just hours before it happened. She had been at a charity event that evening, they said, smiling and chatting with donors, full of life and energy, and then just hours later, gone. My mind kept trying to make sense of it, searching for warning signs I might have missed, replaying our last conversation over and over, looking for clues that something was wrong. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing that suggested she was in any danger, that her body was about to betray her in such a catastrophic way. The funeral was scheduled for Friday afternoon, 4 days after her death, and as that day approached, I felt this growing sense of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I didn't want to go, didn't want to see her in that coffin, didn't want to accept the finality of it all, but I knew I had to be there. For Emily, for Sarah, for myself. The morning of the funeral, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, unable to decide what to wear, as if that decision somehow mattered, as if choosing the right black dress could somehow make this easier to bear. My hands were shaking as I got dressed, my stomach churning with anxiety and grief, and I remember thinking that I should eat something, but the thought of food made me nauseous. I kept checking my phone obsessively, scrolling through old text messages from Sarah, reading her words over and over, hearing her voice in my head, trying to hold on to every memory before they started to fade. The funeral home was across town, and I took an Uber because I didn't trust myself to drive, didn't trust my hands to stay steady on the wheel, or my mind to stay focused on the road. The driver tried to make small talk, asking about my day, commenting on the weather, completely oblivious to the fact that I was falling apart in his back seat, and I gave him one-word answers while staring out the window, watching the city blur past, thinking about how life just continues for everyone else, even when your world is ending. The funeral home was one of those old, elegant buildings that tried too hard to feel comforting, but instead just felt oppressive and heavy, with the weight of too much grief contained in one space. I arrived early, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stand sitting at home anymore, couldn't stand the silence and the waiting and the knowing that in just a few hours I would have to say a final goodbye to the person who had saved me in more ways than she ever knew. The parking lot was already half full, and I sat in the car for a few minutes after it stopped, taking deep breaths, trying to gather the courage to walk through those doors and face what waited inside. Emily had told me they were having an open casket, which I understood was important to her, important to the grieving process. But the thought of seeing Sarah lying there, cold and still and lifeless, made my chest tighten with panic. I finally forced myself out of the car, my legs feeling weak and unsteady, and walked toward the entrance where a man in a dark suit stood like a somber sentinel, nodding sympathetically at each person who passed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of flowers, that overwhelming, cloying smell that would forever after remind me of death and loss and this terrible day. The viewing room was to the left, and I could hear the soft murmur of voices, the occasional sob, the shuffling of feet on carpet. I paused at the entrance, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white, looking into the room but not yet entering, and that's when I first saw the coffin. It was positioned at the front of the room, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, lilies and roses and orchids and whites and creams and pale pinks, beautiful and terrible all at once. I couldn't see Sarah from where I stood, couldn't see inside the coffin yet, and part of me wanted to turn around and run, to escape this nightmare and pretend it wasn't happening. But Emily spotted me from across the room, and her face, already swollen and red from crying, crumpled even more when our eyes met, and she rushed over to hug me, collapsing into my arms like a child seeking comfort from a parent. We held each other for a long time, both of us shaking with grief, and when we finally pulled apart, she took my hand and said, "Come see her, come say goodbye. She looks peaceful." Those words felt like a betrayal somehow, as if peace was something to be celebrated when what I wanted was for her to be alive, to be anything but peaceful in a coffin. Emily led me forward through the small crowd of early arrivals, past coworkers and friends and distant relatives I had never met, all wearing the same expression of sympathetic sorrow that made me want to scream. And then we were there, standing beside the coffin, and I was looking down at Sarah for the first time since she died, and my breath caught in my throat because she did look peaceful. She looked like she was sleeping, and that made it so much worse somehow. They had dressed her in her favorite blue dress, the one she wore to important meetings, the one that brought out her eyes, and they had done her makeup carefully, trying to bring color to her face, trying to make her look alive even though she wasn't. Her hands were folded across her chest, holding a single white rose, and I noticed they had put her wedding ring back on, the one she usually kept on a chain around her neck next to her heart. I stood there staring at her, my mind refusing to accept that this was real, that this still, silent figure was the same person who had been laughing with me 4 days ago, making terrible puns and stealing French fries off my plate. Emily was talking beside me, saying something about how the funeral director had done such a beautiful job, how her mother would have approved, but I wasn't really listening because something felt wrong, something I couldn't quite identify, some detail that was nagging at the edges of my consciousness. I told myself it was just grief playing tricks on me, just my desperate mind looking for any reason to believe this wasn't really happening. So I pushed the feeling aside and stepped back to let other people pay their respects. The funeral service was scheduled to start at 2 o'clock, and as the time approached, more and more people filed into the room until it was packed with mourners, standing room only, a testament to how many lives Sarah had touched during her time on this earth. I found a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to see everything but far enough back that I wouldn't be the center of attention when I inevitably broke down during the service. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes and a practiced expression of solemn sympathy, moved around the room making final adjustments, straightening flowers, checking with family members, preparing for the service to begin. I watched him approach the coffin, saw him lean over to do something, adjust Sarah's hands maybe, or smooth her dress, routine preparations that he had probably done thousands of times before. But then he paused, and I saw his expression change, saw confusion flicker across his face for just a second before he smoothed it away and continued with his tasks. That nagging feeling intensified in my chest, that sense that something was off, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me see things that weren't there. The service began with a prayer, then a hymn, then a series of speakers who came forward to share memories and stories about Sarah, painting a picture of a life well lived, a person who had made a difference, who had mattered. I was scheduled to speak last, and as I sat there listening to others talk about her kindness, her strength, her unwavering integrity, I felt the words of my own eulogy dying in my throat, felt the impossibility of capturing who she really was in just a few minutes of speech. When my turn came, I stood on shaking legs and walked to the podium, my prepared notes clutched in my sweaty hands, and I looked out at all those faces, all those people who had known Sarah in different ways, in different contexts, and I wondered if any of them truly understood what she had meant to me, how completely she had changed the trajectory of my life. I started to speak, my voice trembling, sharing stories about our time together, about the lessons she taught me, about the way she could make you feel like the most important person in the world when she gave you her full attention. I was maybe 3 minutes into my speech when I made the mistake of looking at her, at the coffin where she lay so still, and I had to pause, had to swallow hard against the sob threatening to escape my throat. That's when I saw it. That's when my entire world stopped turning, and my heart seemed to stop beating, and every single thought in my head went completely silent. Her chest moved. I saw it. I saw her chest rise just slightly, just barely, the tiniest movement that could have been a trick of the light or a shadow or my grief-addled imagination. But I knew. I knew with absolute certainty that I had just seen my dead boss take a breath. Time seemed to slow down to an impossible crawl as I stood there frozen at the podium, my mouth hanging open mid-sentence, my eyes locked on Sarah's coffin, watching, waiting, praying that I would see it again, That tiny movement that had shattered my reality into a million jagged pieces. The room had gone quiet, everyone waiting for me to continue my eulogy, probably thinking I was overcome with emotion, which I was, but not in the way they assumed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my throat, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at her chest, willing it to move again, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Seconds passed, maybe 10, maybe 15, I couldn't tell because time had become meaningless. And then it happened again, another small rise and fall, subtle enough that nobody else seemed to notice, but to me, it was as clear as day, as obvious as the sun in the sky. And I knew beyond any shadow of doubt that Sarah was alive. The realization hit me like a physical blow, like being struck by lightning. Every nerve in my body suddenly on fire with adrenaline and terror and desperate hope. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out, just this strangled sound that made everyone look at me with concern and confusion. Emily was rising from her seat, reaching toward me, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown, and maybe I was, but not the kind she thought. I finally found my voice, and what came out was loud and sharp and cut through the hushed atmosphere like a blade. "She's breathing," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "She's alive, she's breathing. Someone help her." The room erupted into chaos immediately. People gasping, murmuring, some standing up, others looking at me like I had completely lost my mind. And Emily was rushing toward me, her face a mixture of horror and pity, reaching for my arm like she needed to calm me down, to comfort me through what she obviously thought was a grief-induced hallucination. But I pushed past her, stumbling down from the podium, my legs barely holding me up as I ran toward the coffin, not caring how crazy I looked, not caring about anything except getting to Sarah, checking her, making sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. The funeral director was moving to intercept me, his practiced calm starting to crack, his hands outstretched to stop me from causing a scene. But I was faster, driven by pure desperation and love, and the absolute certainty that my boss was alive in that coffin, and nobody was doing anything to help her. I reached the coffin and looked down at her, and I swear I saw her eyelids flutter, just the tiniest movement, barely perceptible. But it was there. It was real. And I grabbed her wrist, feeling for a pulse, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hold them steady. At first I felt nothing, just cold skin, and my heart sank, thinking maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe grief really had driven me mad. But then I felt it, faint and slow, but definitely there. A pulse, weak but present, proof that life still flickered inside her body. "Oh my God!" I screamed, turning to face the stunned crowd. "She has a pulse. She's alive. Call an ambulance. Somebody call 911 right now." The room descended into complete pandemonium, people shouting over each other, some rushing forward, others backing away, and Emily was there beside me, her hand on Sarah's other wrist, her eyes wide with disbelief, and something that might have been hope starting to bloom through the shock. The next few minutes were absolute chaos, the kind that burns itself into your memory with such intensity that you can recall every single detail years later, every sound, every smell, every desperate prayer whispered under your breath. Someone had called 911, and I could hear them shouting into the phone, trying to explain the impossible situation, that there was a woman who had been declared dead, who was at her own funeral, who was apparently alive. The funeral director had gone pale, his professional composure completely shattered, and he was stammering something about how this was impossible, how she had been examined by a doctor, how there must be some mistake. Emily was crying again, but these were different tears now. Tears of confusion and desperate hope and fear all mixed together, and she kept saying, "Mom! Mom! Can you hear me? Please wake up. Please be okay." Her voice breaking with each word. I had moved to Sarah's head, was leaning close to her face, trying to feel for breath, for any sign of life beyond that faint pulse we had found, and I felt it, the softest whisper of air against my cheek, warm and real and absolutely unmistakable. "She's breathing," I confirmed, my voice stronger now, more certain. "She's definitely breathing. Where is that ambulance?" The other mourners had backed away, forming a circle around the coffin, some praying, some crying, some just staring in shock at the scene unfolding before them, unable to process what was happening. I heard someone say it's a miracle, and someone else respond that it was impossible, that dead people don't just come back to life, and I wanted to scream at all of them that she was never dead in the first place, that someone had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake that had almost cost Sarah her life. A coworker who had been a nurse before changing careers pushed through the crowd and took over, checking Sarah's vital signs more professionally than I could. and she looked up with wide eyes and confirmed what I already knew. "She's alive," she said, her voice filled with awe and confusion. "Her pulse is weak and her breathing is shallow, but she's definitely alive. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." The sound of sirens grew louder outside, growing closer, and I felt this overwhelming wave of relief wash over me, so powerful that my knees buckled and I had to grip the edge of the coffin to stay standing. They were coming. Help was coming. And Sarah was going to be okay. She had to be okay, because the alternative was unthinkable. The paramedics burst through the doors moments later, their equipment clanging, their voices sharp and professional as they assessed the situation, and I saw the confusion on their faces when they realized they were responding to a call about someone who was supposed to be dead. They worked quickly, efficiently, moving Sarah from the coffin onto a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors, starting an IV, all while asking rapid-fire questions that nobody could really answer. "When did she stop breathing?" they asked. And we had to tell them that we thought she had stopped breathing 4 days ago, that she had been declared dead, that we honestly had no idea what was happening. The lead paramedic, a woman with short gray hair and steady hands, looked at us like we were all insane. But the monitors didn't lie. They showed a heartbeat, showed brain activity, showed someone who was very much alive even if they were in serious distress. They wheeled Sarah out of the funeral home on that stretcher, past the rows of chairs that had been set up for her memorial service, past the flowers that had been bought to honor her death, past all the people who had come to say goodbye, and were now witnessing something that defied all logic and reason. Emily and I followed close behind, climbing into the ambulance without asking permission, neither of us willing to let Sarah out of our sight for even a second. The ride to the hospital was a blur of beeping monitors and medical jargon I didn't understand, and desperate prayers I kept repeating in my head like a mantra. "Please let her live. Please let her be okay. Please don't let this be some cruel trick where we get her back only to lose her again." The paramedics were in constant communication with the hospital, trying to explain the situation, trying to prepare them for what was coming, and I could hear the disbelief in the voices on the other end of the radio. The ambulance raced through traffic, sirens wailing, and I held Sarah's hand, which felt warmer now than it had in the coffin, and I talked to her constantly, telling her to hold on, to fight, to come back to us, that she was going to be okay, that we loved her, that she couldn't leave us, not now, not when we had just gotten her back. Emily sat on the other side, holding her mother's other hand, tears streaming down her face, and we locked eyes across Sarah's body, sharing a moment of understanding that transcended words, both of us thinking the same thing, that we had almost buried her alive, that if I hadn't seen that breath, if I hadn't trusted what my eyes were telling me even when everyone thought I was crazy, Sarah would be 6 feet underground right now, trapped in a coffin, a fate too horrible to even contemplate. The hospital was ready for us when we arrived. A whole team of doctors and nurses waiting at the emergency entrance, and they descended on Sarah the moment the ambulance doors opened, whisking her away on the stretcher while shouting medical terms at each other, stat this and code that, a choreographed dance of emergency medicine that I had only ever seen on television. Emily and I tried to follow, but a nurse gently but firmly stopped us, directing us to a waiting room, telling us that the doctors needed space to work, that they would update us as soon as they knew anything. The waiting room was sterile and cold, filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and outdated magazines, and a television playing some mindless show that neither of us paid any attention to. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us too stunned to speak, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened, our minds trying to catch up with a reality that had shifted so dramatically in such a short time. Finally, Emily turned to me, her eyes red and swollen, and said, "You saved her life if you hadn't seen that breath, if you hadn't stopped the funeral," and she couldn't finish the sentence because we both knew exactly what would have happened. I didn't feel like a hero, though. I felt shaky and scared and confused, trying to understand how something like this could happen, how the medical system could fail so catastrophically, how Sarah could be declared dead when she was very much alive. Hours passed in that waiting room, each minute feeling like an eternity, and we sat there drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine and jumping every time a doctor walked by, hoping for news, for answers, for some kind of explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. Other family members started arriving, having heard what happened through a frantic phone tree of calls and texts, and the waiting room filled with whispered conversations and shocked faces and questions nobody could answer. Emily's aunt kept saying it's a miracle. It's a genuine miracle. And while I suppose it was, it also felt like something darker, something that spoke to failures and mistakes and systems that were supposed to protect us, but had nearly killed someone we loved. Finally, after what felt like days, but was probably only 3 or 4 hours, a doctor emerged, still wearing his surgical cap and looking exhausted, and we all jumped to our feet, surrounding him, desperate for information. He introduced himself as Dr. Martinez, and he looked at us with an expression that was hard to read, something between amazement and concern. "She's stable," he said, and we all exhaled collectively, a sound of relief so powerful it was almost a sob. "She's in a coma," he continued, "but her vitals are improving, and we're cautiously optimistic about her chances for recovery." The questions came rapid fire then, everyone talking over each other, but the main question, the one we all needed answered, was how. How could someone be declared dead when they were actually alive? Dr. Martinez ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable, and explained that based on what he had seen in Sarah's medical records and what the attending physician from 4 nights ago had documented, she had presented with all the classic signs of death: no pulse, no respiration, no response to stimuli. But what they believed now, what the tests were suggesting, was that she had suffered what's called a cataleptic seizure, or possibly been in a state of profound hypothermia, induced, suspended animation that mimicked death so completely that even trained medical professionals had been fooled. "It's extremely rare," he said. "We're talking about something that happens maybe once in a decade, maybe less. A perfect storm of circumstances that created the appearance of death, when really she was in a state of such reduced metabolic function that it was nearly impossible to detect life." He explained that in the old days, before modern medical technology, this kind of thing happened more often than people realized, which is why some cultures started putting bells in coffins, why some people were so terrified of being buried alive that they made elaborate plans to prevent it. In Sarah's case, the initial examination had been done at her home in the middle of the night by paramedics who, finding no signs of life after extensive attempts at resuscitation, had made the call that she was deceased, and the subsequent examination by the medical examiner, done hours later when her body temperature had dropped even further, had confirmed that initial assessment. But somewhere in that coffin, surrounded by flowers and mourners, her body had started to slowly, miraculously, warm back up. Her metabolism had begun to rev back up to minimal but detectable levels, and she had started that long journey back from the edge of death, and if I hadn't noticed, if I hadn't trusted my own eyes, she never would have made it back. The days that followed were a strange mixture of relief and trauma and waiting. So much waiting, sitting in hospital chairs and watching monitors and hoping for any sign that Sarah was going to wake up, that she was going to come back to us fully, and not just as a living body with no consciousness inside. Emily and I took turns sitting with her, talking to her, playing her favorite music, reading her favorite books aloud, doing everything the doctors suggested might help bring her back to consciousness. I told her about what had happened at the funeral, about how I had seen her breathe, about the chaos that had ensued, and I apologized for not trusting my instincts sooner, for not questioning her death more thoroughly, when something in my gut had told me that losing her so suddenly didn't make sense. The hospital room became a second home, filled with flowers that people kept sending, so many flowers that the nurses had to start moving them to other rooms because there wasn't space for them all, and I found it grimly ironic that she was surrounded by the same flowers that had been at her funeral. Lilies and roses meant for mourning, now transformed into symbols of hope. News of what happened spread quickly, and it became a media sensation. Local news crews wanting to interview us, asking how it felt to witness a miracle, and I refused every single interview because it wasn't a miracle. It was a failure, a systematic failure that had almost cost Sarah her life, and I was angry. So angry at everyone who had declared her dead without being absolutely certain, at a system that allowed for such catastrophic mistakes. Emily handled the press, did a few interviews where she expressed gratitude and relief, and she was much more gracious about it than I could have been. But I could see the trauma in her eyes, the knowledge that she had almost buried her mother alive, that she had been planning a funeral and dividing up possessions while her mother was actually fighting for her life inside a coffin. On the 5th day after we found her alive, Sarah's fingers twitched, just slightly, when I was holding her hand and telling her about something funny that had happened at work, and I called for the nurses immediately, my heart racing with hope. They came running, checking her vitals, adjusting machines, and the doctor on duty said it was a good sign, that it meant her brain function was improving, that we should keep talking to her, keep stimulating her senses. On the 7th day, her eyes started moving beneath her closed lids, rapid eye movement that suggested she might be dreaming, and I found myself wondering what she was dreaming about, if she knew what had happened to her, if she had been aware on some level during those 4 days when everyone thought she was dead. On the 9th day, she woke up, and it was nothing like the dramatic movie scenes where someone gasps and sits up suddenly. It was gradual, slow, her eyes fluttering open for just a few seconds before closing again, then opening for longer periods, confusion and fear evident in her expression as she tried to figure out where she was and what had happened. I was there when it happened, sitting in the chair beside her bed, reading aloud from a book she had recommended to me months ago, and I saw her eyes open and focus on me, really see me, and the relief that flooded through me was so intense I started crying, big ugly sobs that I couldn't control, and I grabbed her hand and said, "You're okay. You're going to be okay. You're in the hospital, but you're safe. You're alive." She tried to speak but couldn't, her throat too dry and damaged from the breathing tube they had put in when she first arrived, but her eyes asked 1,000 questions, and I promised her that I would explain everything once the doctors had examined her, once they had confirmed that she was really back with us. The medical team rushed in when the monitors started showing her increased awareness, and they did their tests, shining lights in her eyes, asking her to squeeze their hands, checking reflexes and responses, and Dr. Martinez came back with a smile on his face, the first genuine smile I had seen from him, and said that she was responding well, that her cognitive functions appeared intact, that we had every reason to be optimistic about her full recovery. Over the next few days, Sarah grew stronger, was able to speak, to sit up, to start eating solid food, and when she was finally ready, when she was strong enough to handle it, I told her everything. I told her about the call from Emily, about the days leading up to the funeral, about standing at the podium giving her eulogy and seeing her chest move, about the chaos that followed, about stopping her funeral and calling the ambulance and riding with her to the hospital. I told her how close she had come to being buried alive, and I watched her face as she processed that information, saw the horror and disbelief and gratitude all flash across her features in rapid succession. She cried then. We both did, holding hands across the hospital bed, and she told me about what she remembered from that night, how she had felt strange at the charity event, dizzy and disoriented, how she had made it home and called Emily to say she wasn't feeling well, and then nothing, just darkness, a void where days should have been, no dreams, no awareness, just absence. She said it was like being erased from existence and then suddenly being written back in, and the thought terrified her in a way that death itself might not have because death is final, complete. But this was something else entirely. This was being caught between worlds, neither fully dead nor truly alive. Sarah spent another 2 weeks in the hospital, undergoing tests, working with physical therapists to rebuild her strength, meeting with psychiatrists to process the trauma of what had happened to her, and I visited every single day, sometimes just sitting quietly with her, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing, both of us trying to make sense of an experience that defied all rational explanation. We talked about the fragility of life, about how quickly everything can change, about the strange miracle of her survival and my role in it. Though I never felt comfortable being called a hero, I just felt like someone who had paid attention, who had trusted their instincts when everyone else had been ready to dismiss them as grief-induced hallucination. She asked me why I had been so certain, what had made me so sure that I was willing to stop her funeral and risk looking insane in front of hundreds of people, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that something in me had just known, some primal instinct or connection we had formed over 5 years of working together, of being family in all but blood, that had allowed me to see what no one else saw, to believe what everyone else thought was impossible. She squeezed my hand and told me that I had given her a second chance at life, and she asked what she should do with it, how she should live differently now that she had been given this extraordinary gift, and I told her to live authentically, to prioritize the things that truly mattered, to not waste time on regrets or fear or anything that didn't bring her joy or purpose. We made plans together, Sarah and Emily and I, about how we would move forward, how we would heal from the trauma of almost losing her, how we would celebrate her second chance at life, and there was something beautiful in that planning, in looking toward the future instead of being trapped in the horror of what had almost happened. The hospital finally discharged her on a sunny Wednesday morning, and Emily drove her home while I followed in my own car, and we got her settled back into her house, the same house where she had collapsed 3 weeks earlier, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she walked through the door, the memories of that night flooding back. But we stayed with her, made her comfortable, reminded her that she was safe, that she was surrounded by people who loved her and would never let anything happen to her. The media attention gradually died down, People moved on to the next sensation, the next miracle or tragedy that captured public attention, and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, though nothing would ever truly be normal again after what we had been through. Sarah returned to work about 6 weeks after waking up from her coma, and the office threw her a celebration that was part welcome back party and part gratitude for her being alive, and she stood there surrounded by colleagues and friends and gave a short speech about appreciating every moment, about not taking anything for granted, about how being given a second chance at life had taught her to focus on what really mattered. She looked at me during that speech, caught my eye across the room, and I knew she was thinking about that moment at the funeral, about how close it had all come to ending so differently, and I smiled at her. A real genuine smile that said I understood, that I had been changed by this experience too, that we were both different people now than we had been before. Life continued, as it always does, days turning into weeks, turning into months, and Sarah and I fell back into our routine at work, though it was different now, deeper somehow, infused with this awareness of how precious and fragile everything was, how quickly it could all be taken away. We still had our late-night conversations over cold coffee, still shared our hopes and fears and dreams, but now there was this additional layer, this shared trauma that had bonded us in ways that went beyond friendship or mentorship. We were survivors together, linked by an experience that most people would never understand. Emily and I grew closer too, united by what we had been through, by the knowledge that we had almost lost someone we both loved more than words could express, and we made a point of having dinner together once a week, the three of us, celebrating being alive and together and grateful for every ordinary moment that could so easily have been taken from us. I started living differently too, making changes in my own life, pursuing dreams I had been putting off, taking risks I had been too afraid to take before, because if Sarah's experience had taught me anything, it was that tomorrow is never guaranteed, that you have to live fully in the present because the future is uncertain and the past is unchangeable. I reconnected with family members I had been estranged from, letting go of old grudges and hurt feelings because life is too short for resentment, and I started writing again, something I had given up years ago, finding solace and purpose in putting words on paper, in telling stories about human resilience and survival, and the extraordinary things that happen in ordinary lives. The investigation into what happened, into how Sarah could have been declared dead when she was alive, concluded about 4 months after the incident, and while there were no criminal charges filed, there were policy changes implemented, new protocols for determining death, requirements for multiple examinations, and more sophisticated testing before someone could be declared deceased. It was cold comfort knowing that Sarah's near tragedy might prevent similar incidents in the future, but it was something, and Sarah herself became an advocate for medical reform, speaking at conferences and working with healthcare organizations to improve training and procedures around death determination. She turned her trauma into purpose, using her platform to ensure that what happened to her would be less likely to happen to someone else. And I admired her strength, her ability to take something so horrible and transform it into something meaningful. Looking back now, almost a year later, I still get chills when I think about that day at the funeral, about that single breath I saw, about how close we came to the most unthinkable outcome. And I'm grateful every single day that I trusted myself, that I didn't dismiss what I saw as grief or imagination or wishful thinking. I learned something profound from that experience, about the importance of listening to your instincts, about trusting yourself even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong, about the power of paying attention to the small details that others might miss. Sarah taught me so much over the years, about work and life and resilience, but the greatest lesson she ever taught me was one she didn't plan. The lesson that came from her near-death and miraculous survival, the understanding that life is precious and fragile and should never be taken for granted, that every breath is a gift, every moment an opportunity, every day a chance to make a difference. I think about the people at that funeral who thought I was losing my mind when I screamed that she was alive, and I wonder if they learned something too. If witnessing that impossible moment changed them the way it changed me, made them question their assumptions and trust their perceptions, and believe in possibilities that seem impossible until they happen right in front of your eyes. The human body is capable of extraordinary things, of surviving in states that mimic death so closely that even experts can be fooled. And Sarah's case was a reminder of how much we still don't understand about the boundary between life and death, about the resilience of the human spirit, about the miracles that can happen when someone refuses to give up hope. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Here's why I'm sharing this experience with all of you today. First, trust yourself, trust your instincts, even when everyone around you is telling you that you're wrong, because sometimes you see things that others miss. Sometimes you know things that can't be explained rationally, and those moments of intuition can literally save lives. Second, never take the people you love for granted. Tell them how much they mean to you, spend time with them, cherish every moment because you never know when everything might change. When a regular Tuesday might become the day that divides your life into before and after. Third, question authority and systems. When something doesn't feel right, don't just accept what you're told because someone in a position of power or expertise says it's true. Be willing to advocate for yourself and others even when it's uncomfortable or difficult or makes you look foolish. Fourth, appreciate the fragile miracle of being alive, of breathing and thinking and feeling, because consciousness is precious and temporary and should never be wasted on things that don't truly matter. And finally, believe in the impossible, stay open to experiences that defy explanation, because the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine, and miracles do happen, not in the supernatural sense necessarily, but in the sense that sometimes, against all odds, against all logic, life finds a way to persist, to survive, to come back from the very edge of oblivion. I saved my boss's life that day at the funeral, but in many ways, she saved mine too, because witnessing her survival, being part of her second chance, fundamentally changed who I am and how I live and what I believe is possible in this strange and beautiful world we inhabit. Have you ever had a moment where trusting your instincts saved someone or changed everything? Have you ever witnessed something that seemed impossible but turned out to be real? I want to hear your stories, your experiences, your moments of impossible survival or miraculous rescue. So please share them in the comments below. Let's create a community of people who believe in paying attention, in trusting themselves, in never giving up hope even when the situation seems hopeless. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about life and death and the importance of every single moment, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find this story and maybe, just maybe, it might inspire someone else to trust their instincts at a crucial moment, to speak up when everyone else is silent, to see what others miss. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more tales of survival and resilience and the extraordinary things that happen in ordinary lives, please subscribe to I Live to Tell and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because there are so many more experiences to share, so many more lessons to learn from the impossible made possible. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, every breath is a miracle. Every day is a gift. And you never know when paying attention might change everything.